Hello, I'm Arik Korman, Communications Director at League of Education Voters and the parent of a fifth grade son in the public school system who needs special education services. In case you're not familiar with us, League of Education Voters is a statewide nonprofit working with families, educators, and leaders to build a brighter future for every Washington student. Our website is educationvoters.org. We believe that education is a tool for justice. One of the systems that perpetrate racial injustice experienced by communities of color is our schools. We believe every child deserves an excellent public education that provides an equal opportunity for success. In order to achieve this, we must pursue radical change in our school systems for equity, justice, and liberation. We must build schools and systems that honor the humanity in every student. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series 7 years ago to share information and build knowledge about important and timely issues. Today's LEVinar is about fostering first steps toward racial healing. Historically, the race conversation and topic are treacherous waters to navigate, and the colorblind approach has robbed us of the framework, language, and power to effectively address and dismantle it. Our guest today is TED speaker and Brownicity.com creator, Dr. Lucretia Berry, author of What Lies Between Us, Fostering First Steps Toward Racial Healing. She will describe how parents and teachers can talk to their children and students about race and race-related trauma. She will also answer your questions. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You'll notice a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This is the space for you to submit questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on the chat function or at info@educationvoters.org. Dr. Lucretia Berry is the founder of Brownicity, Many Hues, One Humanity, which you can find at brownicity.com. It's an agency dedicated to advocacy, education, and support for racial healing and anti-racism. She is a wife to Nathan, mother of 3 little girls, and a former college professor whose love for humanity has led her to author What Lies Between Us, Fostering First Steps Toward Racial Healing, a journey guide designed specifically for beginners. She is the anti-racism curriculum specialist for Community School of Davidson, North Carolina, a contributor for Encourage.me, a TEDx and Q Ideas speaker in Charlotte, and a senior consultant for Point Made Learning's The American Dream Game. Lucretia and her family get to be part of the amazing community that is Mosaic Church in Charlotte. She is a lover of dark chocolate-covered almonds and dancing. Lucretia earned her PhD in curriculum and instruction and her MA in English from Iowa State University, as well as her BA from South Carolina State University. Welcome, Dr. Lucretia Berry.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Arik.
You are very welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. How did you come up with the name Brownicity?
Okay, well, Brownicity is a made-up word. I say that it's a word from the future. It's 2 words put together, brown and then icity from ethnicity. And brown represents the melanin that we all have. So here's a little background to that. I am in a multiracial family. My husband is white, so we have our daughters are multi-ethnic, and so we needed a framework. We needed language so that our children would have the agency and the fluidity to be able to talk about, what we look like, our phenotypes, what children observe, in and outside of the confines of the racial binaries or the constructs that, once they walk outside the door, people will try to put them into these categories. And so we needed space to have all of those conversations. And so brown is the unifying factor. Actually, one of our kids came up with it at 4. Our oldest said, "We're all hues of brown." Daddy is light brown and mommy is deep brown. And she said, "And I am medium brown." And so we kind of use that as a launching pad to teach her, of course, about melanin and why mommy's ancestors would have had more melanin because they came from a place closer to the equator and would have needed more melanin as sunscreen. And then daddy's ancestors came from a place further away from the equator and would have needed less melanin to absorb more of the sun's rays. And so like this super simple, kids can understand it, adults can understand it as essentially why we look different. And then that gives us the normalcy from, you know, toddlerhood to talk about skin tone variations and why we look, you know, our similarities and differences. So that's what brown is. It represents our melanin that we all have. And then icity comes from the word ethnicity, and ethnicity means that which we have in common. So our tagline is many hues, one humanity. We are many hues, but we are one humanity. Look different, but also understand that we are one human family. So that's where the name brown comes from.
I love that. Great. Well, and while we're defining terms, how would you define anti-racism?
Well, brownicity, I would want to make sure that I'm sticking to what we have written. It's the policy or practice of opposing racism. Just that simple. That's anti-racism. So whether that's policies, ideas, beliefs, practices, anti-racism will be actively opposing those things that keep racism in place.
And would it be fair to say that just saying you're not racist means that you are not pushing back against the racist system that we're all living with?
Right. So saying that I'm not racist is, first of all, that's not actively anti-racist. It's not opposing anything. It's basically just wearing a badge of I'm a good person, or if you perceive being non-racist as a good person. So it really is about the morality of, or the virtue of a person, and has nothing to do with actively dismantling beliefs and policies and practices that have been at work for hundreds of years in order to subjugate all of us to a racialized hierarchy. So I use the story of MAD against drivers, and how through MAD they actively got laws enacted and policies changed so that the death rate that used to be a really high death rate due to drunk driving, but then MAD organized the moms got together and said no more, and then we rallied around them. Now I wasn't even driving then, and I wasn't a drunk driver, and actually I don't know people who did that. However, you wouldn't say, or you wouldn't negate their claim by saying, well, I don't drink or I don't drive, right? No, you wouldn't do that. Like, you rally around, you support. And now today we have far less incidents of death due to drunk driving. So that's kind of the difference. We want to be active, participate, and engaged, and intentional and mindful.
I love that analogy. That's really great. So when should we start talking to our kids about race? And what does that look like at different ages and stages?
Well, it will probably, well, I would say from the beginning, not maybe when they first come out of the womb, but at least by at 3 months. Research shows that 3 to 6 months, the children can distinguish differences, right? So I'll just pull for my family. Of course, our children, our babies, could determine the difference between their mom and their dad, and not because of our height, but because we physically look different. And children can observe that. And then we know as early as 5 years old, they have observed this racial hierarchy that our society has put in place. Now, they might not be having a conversation with you about it, parents and teachers, because you probably aren't having a conversation about it. So they haven't learned the language to do that, but they have observed it. And so in our family, what we have done, or what we did, is very early on normalized language around how people look, phenotypes. So we normalized that language as early as possible, because there's no pretending that mommy and daddy look the same. Like, we can't even give these anecdotal abstract messages like that. All people are the same. Like, well, no, they're not. And our children can observe when we go outside of our home that mommy may experience society differently than daddy does, So again, children are observing everything around them, and then they are negotiating and trying to make meaning of what they are observing, and the society in which they're interacting. So for us, it was important to normalize this kind of conversation really early on. So then when it came time to talk about the meanings that have been ascribed to how people look, because that's two different things.
Yeah.
There's how you look, and then there's the meaning that society has ascribed to how you look, which is what race really is and racism really is. And so for us, it was, like 4 and 5 years old when we're about to go to school and learn who knows what, and interact with other kids and other families and other adults that we don't have this immediate access to. Like we can't stand as a like in the middle and kind of translate or a mediator. So we of course wanted to make sure that our children already had tools and already have this insight. Again, I liken it to sex education. Like you don't start, first of all, like when they are when our children's hormones kick in, like that's not when you have a conversation about sex. And you definitely don't start with like the graphic intimacy of sexual intercourse. That's not where you start. Like you started with anatomy and the body parts, and you start that really young, because if your son is, calling it a pee-pee by the time he goes to, school, well, that you need to do better. So we want to give language and normalize the conversations as early as possible. And maybe your next question is how to do that. I mean, and that would come with books. Like you can use books the same as you would with anatomy, and you point out body parts and name body parts. And so with books, in media, you could talk about, you give your kids language about people's skin tones. Like with our family, we are literally it's 5 of us, and we're 5 different skin tones. So we would name our own skin tone. So I got to name my skin tone, and each child names their own skin tone, a beautiful name. It has to be beautiful, healthy, vibrant name of your skin tone. And then we'd sing songs about it. And it's just so normal. And our children would be in public talking about the degree of somebody's melanin. Well, Mom, that lady has way more melanin than you. I'm like, yes, she does. Isn't it so beautiful? You see, so so normal. And then you can build and bring in books and stories that help kids understand our history of kind of categorizing people into a racial hierarchy in our country. And then talking about how, people whose ancestors came from Africa, what they were subjected to, and people who were here already, natives, what they were subjected to, and people who came from Europe. So you can, of course, that means that parents have to have, a pretty good understanding. Doesn't have to be great, doesn't have to be thorough, but have a general understanding in order to break it down to your child at whatever age and stage they are. Because it's hard to give a prescription, because children are different, families are different, your neighborhood is different.
So true.
I said that was a long answer.
Oh, yeah. No, that's great. So I got a question in the Q&A, which is, do you have any book recommendations for preschool age kids? Does anything pop to mind?
Well, you mean to talk about skin tone? And
yeah, just to open the door to the conversations about race.
Well, yes. So our go-to, and I do workshops using, oh wait, I have them right here.
Oh, nice.
Right here. This is how often I do this. So all the colors we are, this one, and then the Colors of Us by Karen Katz, and All the Colors We Are is by Katie Kissinger. And I, we have lists on our website, but like this book just talks about why our skin, so it's the science of why our skin looks the way that it does. It's beautiful, gives your children language like melanin and ancestors. And actually, yeah, I read this after our family's conversations, so I felt like they were eavesdropping, and then wrote a book and didn't tell us. And then The Colors of Us talks about, all of us being these hues of brown as well. But again, giving your skin tone these beautiful names. Now, again, a skin tone is different than racial categories.
Mm-hmm.
And that would come through, when you begin to talk about history. I'll have to think of books that would make that bridge. But those are the books that just can make you comfortable talking about phenotypes.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. So how do we talk to our kids about what's happening right now? And because it's so nuanced and so complex. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of it does depend on how old your kids are. But how would you tackle something like this?
Well, so again, with us, because it's normal. So our children know kind of the patterns of how racism has worked in our country. And so they already have a framework and language. So when things are happening on the news, we as a family talk about them. And really what that looks like is, mommy and daddy having a conversation. And so we're kind of modeling, how to talk about these things, that we are processing these things, how these things feel, and how unfortunate that it is. So we're having the conversation. And of course, they're there at the table and they chime in. We are observing and aware of how it is impacting them, because sometimes, too much is too much. You have to watch to see what is too much. But, essentially, to not allow your kids to know what is happening is negligent, because it gives this false impression of the world that we actually live in. And I have the honor of teaching anti-racism education as a high school course. And, my 9th through 12th graders, when I teach them kind of the history of racism and race, in our country, and they learn about, they essentially are learning all of these things that they hadn't known before, like they weren't taught, in history and social studies and civics. They are livid because they feel betrayed. They feel that, like, how come people haven't been telling us this all along? And actually adults feel the same way when I teach adults too, and adults feel the same way. And then there's a little shame with that. And that's so unfortunate. And so I tell them, well, it's not your fault that you weren't taught these things. So you can feel bad for a split second, but then you got to move past it, because that's not going to help you. So I wouldn't deprive them. Again, having the conversations now gives them agency, and lets them know that I feel like it also gives them hope, because all of the kids that I've had the opportunity to teach say, like, they all purpose to do better. It's as if they're saying, y'all have done a terrible job.
Yes.
We will do better.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so we don't want to, deprive them of it. Even if they need the opportunity to, maybe they live somewhere that they will never touch this personally, like the injustice that they're seeing on the news. But it's like, we shouldn't do, like, they've already kind of been maybe put in a bubble, because of segregation, or that's a part of our culture and climate in the United States. And so then you don't want to do it again by saying, well, no, because when they see what's going on, it's a chance to expand their empathy and compassion and humanity. And we don't want to rob them of that, because that's good for them. I know that our children, they do get upset, but I think that's right. Like, that's the right response. I would be concerned if when we have these conversations about what's going on, or if they saw something in the news or read a book, I would be concerned if they just shrugged their shoulders and went on about their day. I'm like, what is wrong with you? So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you talked about teaching, how you have the opportunity to teach 9th through 12th graders. And in our country, 80% of our teachers are white. How would you recommend that teachers across the country and here in Washington State can effectively teach their kids about race?
Right. So, I mean, teachers have an enormous amount of power to shift this thing. And I know, teachers think that they're beholden to, only do what the standards say that they can do. But there are all kinds of creative ways to incorporate, even within the existing standards, ways to empower and equip and give our kids agency around, anti-racism. And so we don't have time for that whole thing, all of it, to say all of those things. But, if teachers could first purpose within themselves and understand that they have a lot of power, like a significant amount of power to turn and shift this boat or whatever, you can do it. And so to begin to seek out ways for professional development around anti-racism, curricular, and then to begin to examine, what they're teaching, how they're teaching it, in ways so that they can use, their whatever 6 hours a day that they have with kids to empower and equip them to, be a part of this shift that we need.
Yeah, no, that's great. In fact, I have a question here from a teacher. So if you do have questions for Dr. Berry, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. Q&A is actually better because then we can see it in one place. So this question is, I teach 5th grade and slavery is part of the social studies instruction. I want to be sensitive to how students experience the information that is being discussed. Any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a tough one because it depends, I guess, that depends on the demographic, the racial demographic of her class, of her school. And, but, I was, before I was working at a school, I was a parent and was invited to, I want to say it was a 4th grade classroom where they were learning about slavery in the United States, chattel slavery. And the teacher, who is white, had invited me just in case kids had more questions, and not because I'm a Black parent, but because of the work I do. And she invited me in. But she had done a phenomenal job of helping, and the resources that she used as well, helping the students understand the significance of chattel slavery in our country. And so it's important that white teachers, and all white teachers, take this on as it's their own burden, because it is. I know sometimes we want to talk about slavery as if it only belonged to enslaved Africans, but it was the burden of everyone in the United States. And so that's how, it should be delivered. Like I even my child, my oldest, who is she's very, very fair skinned. And she says, well, how come? And she's, the school we are part of is predominantly white. And she says, well, how come when we talk about certain events, in slavery, like they all look at me, and I just tell her, well, that's unfortunate that they do that, but it's because they haven't been able to have like this dialogue that has made it normal, or they're looking to you for something that they believe that the teacher can't give them, or they're looking towards you for reaction. So I say to the teachers that I get to consult with is to take on that burden as if it were your own burden. Oftentimes, white teachers will say, well, I feel like whenever I'm teaching anything about, African-American history in the United States, it's just like poor, they're victim, victim, victim. And I don't want my students to, my African-American students, the few that I have, to feel like victim and beaten down. So I said, well, shift the focus. Shift the focus onto white violence, because the white violence is what enabled all of the subjugation of African Americans. So if you shift it to the white violence, then you are white and you have total, and one of the teachers was like, yes, I'm white. Like, I can really dig into that. And I'm like, yes. So then the focus shifts from, old, poor Black student to, okay, let's wake up, white students, and look at this part of our history, and how will we be different from that? Now, that's a little different than centering whiteness. It's not about that, but it is kind of shifting it from, the enslaved Africans who were like the subjects, and putting it onto the enslavers and the people doing the injustice. So sorry, I know that isn't like a clear answer, but I want to say, oh my gosh, I'm slipping my mind about what resource talked about that. I want to say Teaching Tolerance has a specific teaching on that.
Yeah, I can certainly send that in the follow-up too, because that's a great resource, Teaching Tolerance. So you mentioned the victims of racism, the victims of slavery. If our children experience racial injustice today, or racial trauma today, how can we help them heal from it? And first of all, how would you define racial healing?
So let's see, we define racial healing as healing from the damage caused by our subjugation. So that's everybody, our subjugation to the construct of racism. So racial healing can occur personally, physically, socially, systemically, and economically, because, race, the construct, has impacted all of those, and I think the first thing is the question. Like, I've never heard anybody ask that question. Like, in a school, in a home, yes, but in a school, I've never heard people say, well, how can we help students who are experiencing racism? How can we heal? That should be common. That should be a part of the counseling, like the counselors. That should be a part, something that is normal for counselors, school counselors, or counselors in general. I think that with this current focus and awareness of racial injustice, people are discovering that counselors and therapists, there is this shortage of counselors and therapists who have any kind of training or background regarding racial healing of the personal, of the personal self. So I am hoping for a shift there. I'm not, like, that's not my area. Like, I'm like, is there a fund? Like, how do we get, can you, like when we needed to go to the moon, and so then the government put all this money towards NASA, like, can we put all this money towards, social, psychological healers, and so that there are people, therapists and counselors in schools that are already in place to move this along. I think it needs to be a part of implemented or integrated into curriculum. So, for example, the curriculum I designed, called What Lies Between Us, often what I hear from people of color is that because of the way that the curriculum is designed, it has a healing element for people of color, because it validates, right? It kind of looks at people of color through a lens of dignity, and highlights, gives this analytical lens of systemic injustice. And so people of color say, oh, I wasn't just making all this up. This is really real. And so I think when we make the shift, even in terms of how we teach history, that begins healing.
I have a follow-up question from a parent who says, how do Black parents navigate white fragility when engaging in a conversation or addressing an issue with a white teacher or white administrator?
Oh gosh, it's exhausting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I've, I've just seen just different instances. Now, me, because I do this professionally, so that's a little different than a parent who doesn't do this professionally. And I think that's terrible that, that is an experience. And so I've seen, I'm going to say African American parents, I've seen them shut down and say, nope, never mind. And even where I am, I'm at a school that is very just like open to learning. The administrators are just open and to learning. So, but because from other past experiences, Black parents have been shut down by white fragility, then they come to me and then they tell me. And I said, well, just so you know, I'm going to go tell the administrators because they will listen, And so I think, Black parents, like if you're in a situation where you're not being heard, then you need to have some kind of alliance with other parents who will hear you, whether that be, white parents or other parents of color, Black parents. Like you need to form an alliance to make sure that you're heard. Because here's one thing I will not do is pretend that like I'm a visitor to a space, like I'm a visitor to, or me and my children are a visitor to the space that is predominantly white. So just because the space is predominantly white and it has been designed, curriculum, visible, invisible, all of that has been designed to perpetuate whiteness. But I'm in that space. I'm not going to pretend like it isn't a space for me too. So you will see me, value me, and hear me. But again, that is exhausting when white fragility is speaking louder and demanding more. And so, alliances, or, they are very important. Yeah. And even for, because it works also against white people who are being mindful and aware and being actively anti-racist, well, then they bump up against white fragility as well. And then, so I always tell people, like white people who are on the journey, like you have to have a community. So whether it's a community of white people who are also on the journey, or a community of anybody who is on the journey, you have to have that community. Otherwise, white fragility will beat you down.
Yes.
Will rob you. Your soul.
Yes. So we have about 10 more minutes for questions, and I have one that's a follow-up to this one actually, and it is, I'm the chairperson for the Spokane NAACP, and we have been receiving increased numbers of cases of racial bullying and normalized use of the N-word. How would you recommend advocates deal with administrators to go about assigning consequences? And what should those consequences be?
Right. And so I think right away, you have to have, I think, and this is in relation to maybe school, like a school orientation, the beginning of the year, you set the precedent, or on your website, wherever it is, you have your, this is who we are. That has to be a part of that. And, you could say, so we do not, we do not use the N-word. And if you do use the N-word, or if you use the N-word, I'll just say that. If you use the N-word on campus, or if you use the N-word towards a student, blah, 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 this is what will happen to you. So you set that up right up front. And you don't, I remember I had some teachers say to me, they did not know how to handle it when kids use the N-word, but they knew exactly what to do when kids use the R word. And so I remember going, well, what's the R word? And they told me, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Okay, so the same thing. Like you have to put that right up front, and they know what's going to happen to them. if they use the R word, the parents know, I mean, the N word, the parents also know. So don't allow your kid to come to school and use the N word and then think you won't be expelled.
Mm.
That's how, that's what, yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. So here's a question again about teachers. Do you have any tips or advice for non-Black persons of color educators on how to face their own bias and microaggressions and anti-Blackness?
Yes, so face them. Like that, the answer was in the question. So that's, again, half the battle of bias is acknowledging it. And we all have biases, right? Because biases are a part of our, primal, fundamental wiring. It's so that we don't have to, it's like the shortcuts that our brains take so it doesn't have to work so hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but in the case where we've assigned meaning to how people look, we have to do this hard work. We have to say, okay, brain, like you can stereotype, the lions and the tigers and the bears. We can still be afraid of them, but you cannot stereotype Black boys or Black men. Like you can't do that. And so you have to have this conversation with your brain, acknowledge you have bias, and then you put things in place to counter your bias. And you have to be very intentional about that, but you can do it. So a great example is my husband. And so he is white. We have been married for 18 years. And whenever we give talks, he says, I have been married to Lucretia for 18 years. She is a Black woman and I have 3 brown girls. And I still have to check my biases. So it isn't, it's not a binary, like, well, one day you were super racist and one day you were not. We've been soaking in, 400 years of racial stories. And they've been shaping us and how we think and how we look at people and how we measure people. So we all have that. But we have to be willing to acknowledge it and, call it out. You don't have to call it out loud like my husband does. He's just on a different level, right? You can call it out within and then put things in place to counter it, to counter those things, to make sure that you are loving people and lifting people up and you're not, and it takes work. It takes work because as soon as you think that you're good, that you're in a good place, then, maybe something traumatizing happens. I don't know, like you almost get in a car accident or something and the person looks different than you do. And then immediately, bam, your shock and fear and like, then you have a thought about, a racist thought or something like that. So again, it's deep work, but we can do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. So this is a follow-up to that. So in talking about family and people that you're close to, how do you navigate the hard conversations with people you are close to, like family, when they start conversations with, I'm not racist, but...
Oh my goodness. Okay, so yeah, I get that's challenging, and it's always somebody's in-law. It's always like my such and such in-law who says that. It's going to depend on your relationship. So if it's a relationship where the people trust you, like, in my family, my relatives trust me. So if, they say something, I can say something back and they go, well, we know she wouldn't just, I'm not belittling them. They know that I am telling them because I love them and I love the world, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on the relationship. If you have a good relationship, say something. If it's not such a, like that you don't think that they're going to receive from you, then use this model. Well, I used to think this way, I used to think I'm not racist, but, so I used to think that, and then I learned this, whatever the this is, and now I do or think this. So something that's very effective is throwing your own self under the bus. And if you throw your own self under the bus, if you show vulnerability about your own learning process and your own learning journey, people lean in. I have seen it work time and time again. But if you try to fix someone or debate someone, they just dig in their heels. So
yeah. Thank you so much. And so here's a broader question, which is, I'm currently living in Trump territory. Do I encourage young people to be active in a part of the country that is openly hostile to them? When I talk with kids, I seem to get sympathy, but when I talk to adults, teachers, and employers, they tend to discourage work on racial equity through economic threats. Young people in this part of the country are constantly battered with go along, get along if you want anything here.
That's so sad.
Yeah.
Um, and it's so difficult. And the irony is, like, yeah, like literally up the street from me is a Trump like neighborhood or whatever. So we have a little bit of that as well. And so then I go back to the alliance, and so find people like don't I like I would not I wouldn't shut myself down. So that, like, don't shut down. And, you have to be who you are. You're possibly a light. There's probably half the people probably are listening to you, or, want to hear what you have to say. But they are afraid to do that openly because, yeah, like, what did you say? Get along, or what that was interesting about that. What is
Yeah.
that? Get along.
Yeah. Go along to get along.
That's so sad, because that, of course, masks our, our light, our uniqueness of who we are. And but I would say you have to find, an alliance, a group where you're constantly being fed and cultivated so you can grow. Um, but don't get yourself annihilated or anything. Be the light that you are. But it's, you have to know the difference between, like, well, let me be a light that's warming people versus let me be a fire that's burning stuff up. So, but I'm more concerned about the soul of people being, cultivated, than I am the people who want to go along to get along. But I imagine, I mean, I've seen this on social media where people are watching, like, they're watching you, they're not commenting or liking, but they're watching and they're reading and they're learning. And you just, like, you have to consistently be who you are. Not saying pick a fight, not saying push back, but just be you. That goes a long way.
That is great. Thank you so much for that. We have time for about 2 more questions. And
Okay.
here's one that's sort of related, and it's about history. And in the desire for healing, how does the destroying of monuments of historical figures who had slaves achieve the right way to do healing? And what impact does it have on the way we teach history in schools?
Wow. Yeah, that question has, it's almost as like you're answering the question in the question.
Mm-hmm.
So, it pertaining to monuments. Okay, so it's pretty complex. So pertaining to monuments, a lot of the, Confederate monuments, were not put up for the reasons, that they say, like, to celebrate and recognize. They really were put up to, during school integration to, show resistance. So, and to be intimidating, right? So that's, why they were put up. But if we think about, why monuments, not the Confederate monument, but why monuments are put up in the first place, you have to think about what message that you're wanting to resonate and reverberate throughout time. What message, what are you trying to say about our country? And I mean, I do think that whatever, let's just say we never tore any monuments down, but there definitely should be far more monuments erected for people who did amazing things for the country as a whole. And, there should be far more women, who have been, monuments dedicated to women and monuments dedicated to, Native Americans. And, when my students learn about, formerly enslaved Africans who fought for the civil rights of all groups, poor white people, Native Asians, migrant workers from Mexico, they are like, why haven't we heard of these people? And why aren't these people, like, why aren't we looking at their stories in museums, and why aren't they erected in the middle of the square, their likeness? And I'm like, yeah, good point. So I don't know, destroying the monuments, I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful or not. I think it's helpful as a statement, in terms of saying, this is not who we should be. The message of this particular person is not representative of the heart of our nation. I don't know. That the monument one is a complicated one. I think, now this is just me, Lucretia, I personally think they should be painted yellow or a particular color and given an asterisk. So then we talk about, now this is how we don't behave, people. So we go back to the whole white violence thing. This is how you betray the country. And yeah, so there's that.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Last question. I am an Indian immigrant and my community doesn't have many people of color. What are some ways to develop relationships with people of color through organizations or other ways? And I know that there are so many people who don't necessarily have a community of people of color around them, and they might be in a white dominated area. How do they find support?
Yeah, so you just have to be really intentional, because depending on where you are, yeah, like African Americans are like only what 12 to 14%, maybe it's 12% of the U.S. And then Latinx are 14%, and I'm not sure. I don't know my number for Asian Americans. But yeah, you have to be intentional. I remember being in graduate school in Iowa, 96% white, and having an Indian immigrant befriend me. He's like, pretty much, let's be friends. I'm like, okay, you just guys, go to various places. I have a white friend who, she is very intentional. So she makes sure she goes to the gym, where in the predominantly Black area. She makes sure, I know people who make sure that their doctors' offices of their kids, or, wherever they can tap into some people of color. They do it churches, games, extracurricular activities. A lot of people use sports for that. You might be able to use like Facebook to initially find a group, and then hop in. I think that's funny because I have a friend who lives in a neighborhood. She's African American. The neighborhood she lives in is predominantly Indian American, and so she's like having the hardest time trying to like build a relationship with her neighbors. So maybe we should connect those two.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Dr. Berry. And thanks to all of you for participating and submitting questions. There were many questions that we didn't have time to get to. So if your question was not answered, or you have one that you just thought of, you can reach Dr. Berry at connect@brownicity.com, which I'll also share in the follow-up email that you'll receive in about 24 hours. Also, League of Education Voters has gathered resources available in communities across Washington state to help us get through this difficult time. Everything from meal services, distance learning resources, school guidance from the State Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and college and scholarship supports to mental health supports, internet and technology resources, childcare, and employment resources. You will find our COVID-19 resources page on our website, educationvoters.org. Our next LEVinar is Wednesday, August 5th, so that's next Wednesday. Washington State Teachers of the Year, Amy Campbell from 2020, Robert Hand from 2019, Mandy Manning from 2018, who was also the 2018 National Teacher of the Year, Camille Jones from 2017, and Nate Bowling from 2016 will share what they're hearing from students, parents, and colleagues in their community. They'll share what students need to begin the 2020-2021 school year, and they'll answer your questions. You can register by visiting our website, educationvoters.org, click on events, then lunchtime LEVinars. I'll also send registration information for this and all of our other upcoming events in the follow-up email. On August 11th, we are gathering superintendents from across Washington state to share how racial equity is being addressed during this historic time. They'll also describe what school is looking like in their districts for the start of the 2020-2021 school year, and also talk about what kinds of support school districts in Washington state need right now as the school year gets underway. And finally, on October 8th, please join us for a statewide virtual free convening around racial equity in education. We'll hear from Dr. Benjamin Danielson, director of the Odessa Brown Children's Clinic in Seattle, who will explore the role of racial equity, diversity, access, and inclusion in our public education system. Then join us as we break into groups to discuss the issue together. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. If you have additional questions or comments, please send them to me, Arik at educationvoters.org, spelled A-R-I-K at educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation with closed caption ability will be available on our website, educationvoters.org, and will be sent to you in the follow-up email, which should land in your inbox in about 24 hours. Feel free to share the recording with your friends and colleagues. If you would like to learn more about League of Education Voters or support our work, please visit our website, educationvoters.org. Thank you again for attending. Each one of us has the right to feel safe and valued. Together, we'll fight for a world in which true educational and economic equity exists. We look forward to seeing you at future LEVinars. Dr. Berry, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was fun. I'm reading all the chats. Good stuff.